For my toolkit presentation, I will be talking about setting objectives and providing students with effective feedback. Setting objectives is an important part of the learning process. It clearly identifies what students need to know and learn. And there are 4 recommendations for setting objectives in the classroom. That your objectives are specific but not restrictive. They communicate the objectives to students and to parents. They connect the learning with previous and future learning, and they engage the student in setting their own personal learning objectives. This chart describes the specificity of learning objectives. When you're creating your learning objectives, you don't want them to be too general or too specific, but you want to find that healthy balance of the appropriate specificity. When setting personal learning objectives, a lot of students don't have experience with this, and so it's important for teachers to model the process and to provide that feedback when they're first learning how to set their learning objectives. Younger students often use I can or I will, and older students might be able to use I know that, but I want to know more about kind of statements. When you're writing a learning objective, there are 3 main criteria. You want to write the learning objectives that communicate what students need, what type of knowledge they need, rather than a statement that communicates the activities. It's important to focus on the knowledge and not necessarily what they're going to be doing. You want to keep the goal specific. You don't want it to be too broad so that, or general, so students aren't clear. It needs to be specific and to aim those goals around learning that students have a clear understanding of the target. And the third one is to aim for moderate difficulty. You want to consider the level of difficulty for each learning goal when you are establishing these objectives. The second part of this toolkit is providing feedback. And here are a couple quotes about feedback. I think the one by Fred Meiser talks about when feedback is not evaluative, it's used to help students assess their performance, identify areas where they're on target, and provide tips what they can do in the future. That's the essence of feedback. Grant Wiggins similarly talks about it describes what you did and what you did not do. Robin Jackson has 3 parts to her definition of feedback. The first one is it shows that relationship to the objectives and what we're going to do to get there. It views feedback as opportunities to learn and grow, and it allows students to get better at learning. Doug Reeves talks about effective feedback is provided in a timely manner so that in future opportunities they'll be able to perform the task, which is measured in seconds, not weeks or months. And then from the book, Providing Students with Effective Feedback, it talks about the instructional dialogue. And that's an important part because it is a dialogue. It's a conversation between teachers and students, and then eventually between students and students, or between the students and himself or herself. I love this quote about the effective feedback occurs during the learning while it's still there and there's time to act on it. Effective feedback does not come at the end of a summative assessment or the end of a quarter. There needs to be opportunities for the learners to act upon that feedback and demonstrate their learning has changed. So what does the research say about feedback? This relationship between achievement and other behaviors is consistent regardless of grade, socioeconomic status, race, school setting. And you can see when feedback and corrective procedure are used, most students can attain the same level of achievement at the top as the top 20% of students, according to Bell and Blank. John Hattie did a study of almost 8,000, or he analyzed almost 8,000 studies, and he found that when you give dollops of feedback along the way, that is the simplest prescription for improving education. It's those periodic, informative measures of how a student is doing that really give you the biggest bang for your buck. So when you look at the characteristics of feedback, there are 5 main characteristics. The first one is it needs to be timely. When, when you're providing feedback, the sooner you can give it to the learning that's occurring, the better. There are 2 links here that will take you to studies that show the difference between delayed and immediate feedback. Obviously, there are times when it's not possible to provide feedback right on the spot, but in those situations, the sooner you can provide that feedback, the better. The second characteristic of feedback is it needs to be specific to a criterion. Using precise language on what to do to improve and how it relates to the learning target or learning goal or learning objective. When you give us a feedback such as great job or you're not quite there yet, it doesn't really tell the learner much. Instead, feedback that might say, I really like how you incorporated the theme of this narrative in your story, blah, 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 blah. Obviously tells the learner much more specifics of what they're doing well, and then you can provide specific feedback on, as you go forward, please continue to use X, Y, and Z. The third characteristic of feedback is that it needs to be corrective or constructive. We need to identify and help students understand what they're doing well, what is correct, what they need to work on. We need to choose those areas of feedback that relate to our major learning goals. And then the constructive or corrective should be encouraging and help students realize that effort is on their part is part of the learning process. The fourth characteristic of feedback is that it should be focused on the product or the behavior and not necessarily the student. When you fully explain the purpose of monitoring and ensure that learners understand how the feedback is meant to help them compete against their own personal best rather than each other, that's where powerful feedback occurs. And the last characteristic of feedback is if it is verified or understood. Students need to understand what the feedback is, and it's okay to ask them, do you understand? I'm going to follow up with you later to assist the students in those areas. If the students don't understand the feedback or are unclear about it, there's no point in providing feedback. So when you look at the 5 characteristics of feedback, timely, specific, constructive, focused on the product, and understood, those 5 elements should allow you to provide the best type of feedback to each learner throughout the learning process. Black and William talk about 3 specific elements of feedback. 1, you need to understand what the desired goal is. 2, there needs to be evidence about where the student currently is in that process. And then 3, how are we going to close the gap between what the goal is and where they currently are? Going back to our learning goal, there are ways that we can recognize what that desired goal is. There needs to be a level of clarity. Clarity of the learning goal, clarity of the content area, clarity of the indicators or mastery objectives. And we're communicating this goal to students through instruction. So there are some methods to ensure that students are learning or understanding these learning goals. Develop I can statements, which we referred to earlier. Provide exemplars or models of products of what they should look like. Have students analyze successful criteria by using other sample products or using ones they've used in the past through the use of rubrics. I think the last point is important. We want students to be successful. So we want to provide opportunities to work on a task until they find that success. When you look at assessment, when students are able to learn about and reflect on their own work using the language of the criteria and the learning goals or learning destinations, they truly have a deeper understanding of the assessment of that learning goal and the feedback that's been provided. Here's a graphic that shows how the learning goals are tied in with the feedback that we provide. We want students to be able to identify what their learning goals are, what that's going to look like, what will successful criteria look like. We want to provide descriptive feedback, what is done well, what can we do differently to improve. And then the next step is peer and self-assessment, which I'll talk about briefly. The last part of that is having students create their individual learning goals. All of these are tied together and as part of the formative assessment process. So how do we know where students currently are? Well, looking at their work samples, their assignments, showing students what they're currently producing gives students a better picture of their current and present levels. And then the third way to close the gap between the goals and where they currently are, providing lots of guidance along the way, providing strategies and tips. We can't assume that students know how to do things. We need to provide that model for them. We need to provide student-friendly versions of the learning targets, along with actual samples of work. They need to see it and hear it. We need to help them understand how they can improve, and then give them the time to improve and apply that feedback. This particular slide shares many different ways you can offer feedback. It can be interactive, one-on-one, which is probably the best because you're really focusing on individual needs. You can do a whole class or a group if there are students who have the same skill or concept need. We're focusing on those behaviors that the student can do something about. Here's an example of one form via Intel the Teach program of how you can provide written feedback to students. Things you did successfully, things you could improve upon, what your next steps are, and then the student keeps this form as they're revising their work. When you're providing feedback, it's important to have appropriate timing. This slide talks about qualities of good timing and bad timing. I think it's important to remember that giving that immediate oral response to questions or a fact, or giving those immediate oral responses to misconceptions really will help the students internalize that feedback. So how much feedback should you give? That's always a question. I think you have to walk that fine line of scaffolding enough support, but not too much where the work has been done for them. And viewing those moments as teachable moments and keeping them small. You don't want to share 5 or 6 teachable moments. You want to keep it reasonable so they can internalize and apply that feedback. This particular graph shows good amounts and bad amounts. Talks about 2 to 3 main points on a paper, providing feedback on important learning targets. So you can see the connection between the learning objectives and providing feedback. There are some strategies to help students learn to use feedback. You can model it as a teacher, teach them how to self and peer assess, be clear about what the learning target is and the criteria, and design lessons which students use feedback on previous work to produce better work. Here is an example of peer feedback form. Talks about providing compliments, suggestions, and I love the part in the middle when you have the reviewer use I statements. I would like to know more about, I am not sure, because then it takes the confrontation away and makes it more of a learning and positive feedback form. This last slide talks about Hattie and Temperley's feedback model, and the part I love most at the end are the 3 questions. Effective feedback answers 3 questions. Feed up, where am I going? Feed back, how am I going? And feed forward, where do I go next? Hopefully you'll be able to see, as a result of this presentation, how setting clear learning objectives and providing specific, timely feedback go hand in hand and help the learner achieve his or her goals.